One day I caught my lovely wife cheating on me. Here is how it happened. My wife is a school teacher. She usually gets off from work at around 3:30 p.m. and arrives home at 4 p.m. I work also. I am a salesman and my job keeps me on the road a lot, so Mai and I enjoy what time can have together. Despite the fact we don't see much of each other, my wife had never given me any reason to doubt her fidelity. Now my wife is knockout gorgeous, with a sweet angelic face, shoulder-length auburn hair, and a tight round ass that catches attention everywhere she goes, but I never saw her looking at another man. What I am about to relate will prove how wrong I was about her. It was a Monday morning when I told my wife that I would be out of town for 2 days for a business meeting in Chicago. While I was busy packing my things and getting ready, the phone rang. My wife answered and she spent about 20 minutes talking to someone and laughing. I did not think this unusual, and as I went out the door I kissed her bye. As it turned out, my trip concluded much sooner than I had expected, and the next evening I was on an airplane heading home. I was really glad that I would be able to spend some time with my wife, and I decided that instead of calling her that I would surprise her, and we would spend a romantic evening together. It was 5:30 p.m. when I arrived. As I entered the living room, I noticed that the house was very quiet and my wife was nowhere to be found. At first, I did not think this unusual as she is sometimes delayed with school activities. When she was not home after 7 p.m. I became somewhat concerned. I went upstairs and turned on the television in our bedroom and waited. Our house has 2 driveways. My wife always parks in the back driveway and it is so close that you can hear the car motor when it pulls up in the drive. It was at around 9:25 when I heard the sound of a car, and when I looked out the back window, I saw my wife's tan 98 Thunderbird pulling in our driveway. I was about run down and meet her when I noticed she was not alone. There was enough light on our porch to tell that the person in the car with her was a man. For a while they just sit there talking, and then he leaned over and kissed my wife right on the mouth. My mouth must have hung open as I watched what transpired. My wife did not resist him, but returned his kiss as her fingers twined through his hair. This was no peck. They were sharing a very deep and passionate kiss. Even from where I was I could see his tongue exploring inside my wife's mouth. When they finally got out of the car, I saw them walk up to the porch and kiss again. As they kissed, I watched his hand reach down and grab my wife's ass, as she began to squirm against him. They kissed for about a minute, then they disappeared under the carport. Then I heard the door open and shut as they walked into the living room. I didn't know what to do. Here I was, up in our bedroom while my wife was with some secret lover downstairs. I knew I had to do something fast. I had 2 options. I could either go down and confront them or I could hide out and see what all would happen. I decided on the later, as I am not disposed to any kind of violence, and though I am ashamed to admit it, the prospect of seeing my charming wife having sex with another man excited me. I slowly and quietly crept downstairs. When I reached the bottom of the stairway, I heard them talking. "Are you sure your husband will not be home?" the man was inquiring of my wife. "No, he will not," she replied. "He has gone to Chicago and he will not be returning until tomorrow evening." "If he were coming back he would have called Sweetie," she said assuredly. "Honey, now let's not talk about that. You know that there is only one thing I want now, Sweetie." "Yes, I believe you, honey, Em." In a while I could hear them kissing again. I walked down the hall until I could see around the partition and into the living room. There was my wife and her lover, embracing and kissing as they stood about 10 feet from me. Their hands were all over each other and I could see their tongues in each other's mouths. One of the man's hands gripped my wife's ass while the other squeezed her breast through her flimsy blouse. My wife was now moaning deeply into his mouth. His working hand loosened the strap that held up her blouse. It fell, exposing my wife's perfect orbs. His mouth left hers and went down to her breast. He took as much of each one into his mouth as he could. His tongue swirled around her nipples. His mouth found hers again, and they took turns driving their tongues down each other's throats. He pulled her skirt up over her head so that her only garment was the thin strip of her nylon panties that barely covered her ass cheeks. As they continued to kiss, my wife reached down between them and took his cock out of his pants. "Oh, Robert," she said. "Please put it in me. I have to have it now, baby. Oh, it's so big, honey. I have to have it in me now," she sighed. My horny wife, couldn't even wait for him to comply with her wishes. She stood back from him, stepped out of her underpants, and jumped up on him with her legs locked around his back. Then using her hand, she guided his cock right into her pussy. Now my wife was actually fucking this guy, and riding him all she was worth. It wasn't a minute before she had an orgasm, and she was just getting warmed up. This guy Robert was telling my wife what a whore and a slut she was, even as he fucked her. "Oh yes, honey," she moaned. "I am a whore for you, baby. Give it to me, baby. She sighed and moaned as she rode his cock faster and faster. I had never seen my wife this way, and I began to think that she was either completely out of mind or drunk. She was actually having one orgasm after another as she bounced her up and down on his cock. He carried my wife over to the couch, laid her down, and started fucking her missionary style. She was going wild. She brought her legs up over his shoulders and began rotating and writhing her ass around like a go-go dancer, trying to get him deeper inside. She was begging him fuck her harder, and he was certainly complying. He was pounding her with relentless thrust, pulling all the way out of her and then slamming back into the hilt. He gripped her ass and pulled her up to him, and started fucking her with short, quick strokes. This sent my wife completely over the brink. Her moans turned to yells and screams, as she bucked and arched her ass upward. She had about 5 consecutive orgasms. I saw her convulse and stiffen against him as he shot his load in her pussy. I was wondering what would happen next, and I soon found out. I heard my wife tell him that she wanted to be fucked in the bedroom. She was actually going to let this guy fuck her in our bedroom and on our marriage bed. Robert then slipped out of his clothes and followed my wife to the bedroom. They passed right by me, as I stepped further back into the kitchen, and I watched them walk upstairs as naked as they were born, my eyes focusing on the nice sway of my wife's ass. I began to wonder why I was letting this go on, but I really wanted to see how far she would go. It wasn't long before I began to hear noises upstairs. The sound of the bed rattling and banging the wall and my wife's moans and sighs indicated that they were going at it hot and heavy. I crept quietly up the stairs, and when I reached the top, I could see the door of our room was slightly opened. When I looked inside, the first thing I saw was my wife down on her hands and knees while the man was ramming her from behind. He would pull all the way out of her and thrust back in repeatedly, making her cry out and yell. I watched her facial expression that would go from a vacant glazed-eyed stare to one of intense ecstasy every time he would thrust into her. Her whole body shook and her big breasts were swinging as he pounded her relentlessly. She came several times with yells and screams as the man came with her. His groans and grunts joined hers in an erotic chorus that went on and on. He then turned my wife around so that she was facing him. He was in a kneeling position, as he drew her legs up around him, as she lay back on the bed. He thrust into her and began working on her with long, steady strokes, as he pulled her legs up over his shoulders. He pumped her harder and harder, until she was moaning and sighing. He then leaned down, and after readjusting his position, he began doing her missionary style. My wife came like a volcano, in an incredible orgasm. It was amazing to watch the amount of pleasure my wife was receiving from this man. I believe that she had more orgasms that evening than she did during our marriage. They did it in all many different positions and she came in every one of them. I wondered who this man was, where she had met him, and how long this had been going on. I also wondered if she was out of her mind, as she wore no condom, and as far as I knew she was not even on any kind of birth control pills. Considering the amount of sperm he had put in her, she just might have needed them. When I had seen enough, I began to wonder where I would be sleeping that night. Obviously, our bed was out of the question. I would have to sleep in the kids' room downstairs, and since we had no kids, that would be no problem. There was also not much danger of my wife walking in on me, since she was preoccupied, and even if she did, she had a lot more questions to answer than me. I didn't get much sleep that night as I kept getting woke up by my wife's moans and yells every she was getting pounded by her friend. It wasn't until around 6 a.m. that I heard the sound of the door shut and the car start as my wife drove her lover home. Most likely he had to go to work or he would have had breakfast in bed. As soon as they left, I put on my suit and tie, and when my wife returned, I told her that I had just got back from my trip. I never told her the truth of the matter. Luckily, this guy left a booklet on the table which I looked through. To my surprise, this lover of my wife turned to be the new principal of the school where she taught. Since I have kept silent, our marriage is still happy, and the principal has kept his job. I wonder though, how many times he has returned while I was away.